Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Murray.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful, rainy Sunday. Thanks, Chris, for that kind introduction. Chris and I were seasonal rangers here a long time ago, and it's good to. It was over a decade now, and it's very good to see Chris in a very important position here at the Gettysburg battlefield. I'm on spring break, so this is what I do on my spring break. So I was looking at options and thinking about going to the beach maybe. You know, it's like 80-some degrees down in Jekyll Island where I like to vacation. And I thought, no, why not go to Gettysburg and do a talk on George Gordon Meade, where it's 40 degrees and raining, but I'm very happy to be here with you all today. So thank you for coming out and talking with me or looking through George Gordon Meade. Chris mentioned my book on Gettysburg, and some of you guys might know this, that I'm working now on a biography of George Gordon Meade, and that will be coming out with LSU Press in a few years. So what I want to share with you guys today is kind of a sneak peek of the last chapter of my book, which is going to be on George Gordon Meade and memory. And I think what we'll get to walk through today and see together is a really interesting legacy of George Gordon Meade's kind of rise to fame and then his decline, both in his lifetime and after his death in 1872, and the way in which Meade and his legacy is often overshadowed by more prominent Union generals, and then, of course, the pantheon of Confederate generals. And I got a bunch of historic photos and slides that I'm going to show you today, and I think you'll really find them to kind of be a special treat. There's some really great photographs in here that I've been digging up in different archives, and hopefully some of which you guys have never seen before, and you'll get to see some insight into my book and my research this afternoon. So let's start with what's kind of on the slide here, our opening slide. This is a close-up photograph of the Meade Equestrian Memorial at Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. Any of you guys been to Fairmount Park in Philly? Very good. Obviously, Philadelphia is very tightly woven to George Gordon Meade. He is a prominent Philadelphian, and we'll look at this monument in a few slides down the road and the way in which Meade's legacy is perpetuated in Philadelphia. And the quote, the tag for my title, "God knows my conscience is clear," is a line that George Gordon Meade wrote to his wife in March of 1864. And if you think about Meade's position in June 63 through the Battle of Gettysburg, and then in the months later, George Gordon Meade has a rocky time, to say the least. And he writes these really intimate letters to his wife. And one thing that comes out of Meade's writing that is very, very clear is that regardless of all the controversy surrounding Meade's leadership at Gettysburg, the vitriolic reviews that he gets in the press, the criticisms from his own officer corps, Meade believes until his dying day that he performed his duty appropriately and correctly at the Battle of Gettysburg. He believes that his conscience is clear. And one thing that comes out of Meade's writing, and we can debate this, and scholars and historians debate this, one thing that comes out of Meade's writing is a sense that his reputation is going to be maligned. He's very sensitive to the press and to his detractors, and you see that in his own lifetime. One thing that is incredibly clear with George Gordon Meade, it seems that people are very polarized on him. That you have very pro-Meade supporters, and then you have people who are very critical of Meade. Both his contemporaries and today. But in 1865, you all have seen this photograph before, or maybe even seen the actual painting in Washington, D.C. When you look at the pantheon of Union generals responsible for preservation of the Union, in 1865, this Norwegian painter puts George Gordon Meade right in the epicenter. And remember, when Meade takes command of the Union Army in June of 1863, he's in charge of a very factious, very volatile Union Army. He represents the third change of command just that year. But George Gordon Meade commands the Army of the Potomac longer than any other Union general, and he sees the greatest victory that this army achieves to date. But Meade's legacy in his own lifetime through 1863-64 is going to be overshadowed. And 150 years later, Meade doesn't stand at the center of Union victory. Meade's overlooked, he's overshadowed, and you get stuff like this. What the heck? And it's $75. I don't know if this is a good buy or not. I can't figure it out. Wow. If you all, P.S., if you want to buy this, after we're done, drive down the Baltimore Pike, get yourself to the Gettysburg outlets, and go to that Civil War and More store. Yeah. I feel like I should get commission if you all were going to be running over there after the program. Probably better commission than I get on my book. But what do we make of this? I mean, this is incredulous. And I've worked at Gettysburg for 9 summers, and I can tell you plenty of times when people came into the visitor center or out on the battlefield and they ask about Grant commanding the Union Army at Gettysburg. And you guys have probably heard similar conversations, maybe when you're out on the battlefield yourself. And then sometimes people would talk about Dwight David Eisenhower commanding the Union Army at Gettysburg. I said, whoa, you guys need more of a history lesson than I can give you right now in 50 minutes. Yes, that is definitely a failure of our educational system, of which I'm now a part of, so go figure. But this is awful, truly awful, in a way in which George Gordon Meade is improperly commemorated in popular culture. So let's start our story in June of 1863. And let's give just a little bit of a background to what Meade's shifting reputation looks like in the summer of 1863. If you ever want to go down to Frederick, going down to Prospect Hall, there's a huge modern apartment complex there now with really fancy, overpriced hotel accommodations outside of Frederick. But you can see the rock in which George Gordon Meade, his tent was, where he took command here in June 28, 1863. Meade very famously thinks he's going to be arrested. You guys have probably heard that story. But if you look through soldiers' letters, their reaction to yet another change of command is variable. This guy from the 93rd New York says, God only knows what this is going to lead to. Meade's commanding the 5th Army Corps at this time. He's relatively unknown outside the U.S. 5th Army Corps, but 72 hours later, George Gordon Meade takes 90,000 men in the Army of the Potomac and wins its most significant victory to date. And what you get after July 3rd, and mostly on the 4th, 5th, and 6th, as the northern media starts to pick up on the news of Gettysburg, is this instantaneous rise to fame. Victory, and the part that I like on the clip on the left is where the headline reads, "Waterloo eclipsed," with 2 exclamation points. If you think about Waterloo in 1815, this climactic battle, a decisive battle that ends Napoleon's reign in Europe, this is a very dangerous comparison. And it puts a lot of expectations on George Gordon Meade and the Army of the Potomac. Waterloo is a battle that's very relevant and fresh in Americans' minds in the 1860s. And then this is Gettysburg, a great victory won. So the Northern public, desperate for a decisive victory, seems to have it in Gettysburg. And as the Union Army starts to pull out and chase or pursue the Confederate Army down through Maryland and ultimately culminating in Williamsport along the banks of the Potomac River, Meade's reputation continues to escalate. When he gets to Frederick, the ladies of Frederick come out and greet him like a hero. Right? They bring him bouquets and flowers, and he writes home to his wife about how they have lionized him. So he gets this great reputation. And on June 15th, a Vermont newspaper encourages George Gordon Meade to be the next president of the United States. And if you know a little bit about Meade's politics, he is woefully apolitical at best. Can you imagine Meade as president of the United States? But the Northern public gets the victory that they want. But then you all know that Meade's failure or his quote-unquote, lethargic pursuit of the Confederate Army to Williamsport, which, quote-unquote, allows Lee to escape across the Potomac River, very much changes Meade's reputation in the eyes of the Northern public and certainly in the eyes of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln very quickly admonishes Meade for not attacking the Confederate Army. He says, your golden opportunity is lost. Meade is so upset about this that in a fit of anger, he sends and offers to resign. And he pursues the Confederate Army into Virginia in the subsequent months. Through the rest of 1863 and into 1864, Meade is going to continue to have to defend his actions at the Battle of Gettysburg. And he writes a letter just 3 days after Christmas, and an often quoted Meade line to his wife, Margaretta, in Philadelphia, and he says, seems like me being here was actually more harmful than it was helpful. And I'm sure he'd find plenty of people who would agree with that point of view. And then in the spring of 1864, George Gordon Meade gets called to testify before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War over his actions and leadership at Gettysburg. He testifies 3 times in March, and then coinciding with the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, here comes Ulysses S. Grant. And a very fitting, this is Grant, obviously, symbolically almost in this photograph, exactly, looking over Meade's shoulder. We can see the slight profile of George Meade right here. And there's a lot of reasons for Meade being overshadowed here on out from 1864 on to the end of the war. Meade's reputation with the press is very contested. He entertains almost no reporters or correspondents. He has a very antagonistic relationship with the press. Grant has a very favorable relationship with the media. So when the national northern media is writing about the campaigns they're taking us to Appomattox, it is Grant that's at the front of the center, and then we're going to see Sherman's rise to prominence, and we're going to see Sheridan's rise to prominence, and Meade is just more and more obscure. If you think about Appomattox in 1865, George Gordon Meade is sick, so he's following the Union Army in an ambulance, and he's not going to be present for the famous surrender in the McLean House in April of 1865. So in sum, if we can kind of distill that into something and to give us a point of departure moving beyond the Civil War, Meade's reputation in his own lifetime is very shifting. It's a very nebulous landscape in which he operates, overshadowed by Grant, constantly defending his actions at Gettysburg, and very, very, very conscious about his reputation. When the Civil War ends, the Union armies have the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. It's 2 days of review, May 23 and 24. And the Army of the Potomac is going to march on the first day, the 23rd. And we can see a couple important people in this photo. Grant. This one is, very good, Andrew Johnson. And then look one over to the right. There's Meade. Yeah. I mean, if you read a little bit about primary accounts about the Grand Review, the first cannon booms that starts or kind of kicks off the Grand Review, and then coming out into the crowd's perspective rides George Gordon Meade on his horse Blackie. And what does the crowd immediately cheer when Meade comes into view? Gettysburg, Gettysburg, Gettysburg. It is the applause of a grateful nation. It is the applause of a grateful nation. Meade stays in the Army after the Civil War is over and after Appomattox. He's going to be instrumental in implementing Reconstruction policies in the South. He's going to oversee the readmittance to the Union of Deep South Southern states. He's going to be in Atlanta. And then ultimately he's going to be sent to Philadelphia, where he finishes out ultimately his life. George Gordon Meade dies in 1872, November the 6th. Meade had taken ill to his house here in Philadelphia. It's on Delancey Street. And he was complaining to his wife and his doctor that he was having severe chest pain. And the doctor comes in, he's bedridden for about a week. And near 6:30 p.m. on November the 6th, 1872, George Gordon Meade, at the age of 56, dies at his house of pneumonia. When Meade dies on November the 6th, 1872, because he's still active duty in the Army, the commanding general, who at that time is William T. Sherman, is going to send out a general order to inform everybody about the passing of the victor at Gettysburg. And they start to plan Meade's funeral. And Meade's funeral, it starts where he dies. If you find yourself in Philadelphia, walk down Delancey Street and you'll see George Gordon Meade's house. This is the house that the good people of Philadelphia gifted to the Meades. And at the top of it, this is 1836 Delancey Street. At the top, you can see Meade's name is sketched into the house. And immediately, once word gets out about the death of George Gordon Meade, the nation grieves, Philadelphia particularly so. The headline of the Philadelphia newspaper reads, "Universal grief," at hearing that their son, George Gordon Meade, had died. Now, Meade's funeral is an amazing spectacle. And one of the things that really struck me in my research is how much the nation respected George Gordon Meade. This is Philadelphia, November 8th, 1872. The Battle of Gettysburg saved the city of Philadelphia from devastation. And if there was nothing else in the career of George Gordon Meade, that alone would have been enough. Philadelphia's grief is perhaps the loudest, and the people of Philadelphia genuinely believed if Meade had not won at Gettysburg, their city would have been invaded by these Confederate marauders. They genuinely felt that Meade had saved their city. And if you're interested in reading and researching a little bit on Meade, his papers are in Philadelphia at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And I've been reading through these a lot, and there's a litany of correspondence comes in from citizens and also men in the Army expressing their condolences upon hearing about George Gordon Meade's death. And it's very clear that they have held him in tremendous, tremendous esteem. And Meade's reputation for all the controversy that comes out after July 4, 1863, for all that controversy with Sickles and Doubleday and the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, it is very clear to 1870s Americans that Meade's action at Gettysburg was right. They're no longer debating this. I mean, monolithically, in general, they're no longer debating this. So William T. Sherman, who is the overall general of the Union Army, starts planning for Meade's funeral. And he puts Irwin McDowell in charge of, I got a response. Could be worse, right? I mean, in charge of Meade's funeral. Think about McDowell for whatever. I mean, this is the general who commands the Union Army at Bull Run. He certainly is his own interesting story in his own right. But Sherman tells McDowell that Meade's wife's wishes will be paramount. And together they collaborate on the funeral procession for George Gordon Meade. So he dies on the 6th, and his funeral procession will begin on the 11th. And it starts with moving Meade's body from his house on Delancey Street to where he will be buried at Laurel Hill. En route to his burial at Laurel Hill, there will be a funeral services at St. Mark's Church. And you can see St. Mark's Church today if you all go up to Philadelphia. This is on Locust Street. It's just a few blocks down from the HSP, the Historical Society. This is the church that Meade frequented. This is the church that he attended. And you can read newspaper correspondence and some of the primary accounts at the time. There are mourners and grievers who start to show up at St. Mark's Church at 8 a.m. on the 11th. McDowell will be one of the first people there. McDowell arrives to the church, and then he's kind of the master of ceremonies, if you will, for the day. He will greet Ulysses S. Grant. Grant arrives around 10. And then William T. Sherman arrives a little bit later. And Meade's body is taken from his house on Delancey Street to a service at St. Mark's Church. If you could look at what St. Mark's Church looks like in 1872, this is what you would see on the inside. It's an incredibly large bereavement ceremony for Meade's death. The newspaper reports at least 50,000 people in and outside the church, not including all the tens of thousands that line the streets for his procession up to Laurel Hill. At St. Mark's Church, the services are going to be conducted by Dr. Hoffman, who's the rector of St. Mark's Episcopalian Church, and then the guy on the right, this is Henry Benjamin Whipple, who was a Minnesota guy, but he had been a man of faith with the Army of the Potomac. So Meade had known him through the war, and Whipple is going to give some comments at Meade's gravesite up at the Laurel Hill Cemetery. For about 2 hours, Americans mourn Meade's death in St. Mark's Church. And then his body is going to leave St. Mark's Church, and there's a very distinguished, very respectable funeral procession to get him out to his burial site at Laurel Hill. He has 6 pallbearers. These are 3. I put 3 of the 6 on here. I suspect you recognize 2 of the faces. On the left is, there we go, Andrew Humphreys, Pennsylvanian, and then on the right, of course, is Sheridan. Now let's see how good our naval history is. Does anyone know the one in the center? This is Rear Admiral Thomas Turner. I know, I'm an Army person myself. My Civil War naval history is passable at best. But these are 3 of the 6. They will put George Gordon Meade's casket on their shoulders. They will take him out of St. Mark's Church. They'll put him in a caisson, and he will be proceeded up to Laurel Hill Cemetery. And in the procession is, of course, old Baldy is brought out of retirement, and he will proceed riderless in the funeral procession. On top of Meade's casket, the casket, of course, is draped with an American flag. On top of the casket are tangible elements of Lee's military life. His uniform is on top of there, as well as a sword and his hat. When they get him out of St. Mark's Church, thousands of people line the streets of Philadelphia. You can recreate, if you're ever interested in this, and kind of walk the funeral procession route block by block, that's hard to say, till they get him on a steamer to put him up the Schuylkill River to get him to Laurel Hill Cemetery, where he will be buried in the afternoon of November 11th. This is a contemporary lithograph of the sketch, of the procession rather, and you can see here crowds lining the Schuylkill, and then this part of the sketch is Meade's casket up to its final resting place. The services at the grave for George Gordon Meade are very short and they're very simple. There's nothing very elaborate. This is all over in about 30 minutes or less. This is Whipple, our Minnesota guy, who conducts the graveside comments. And then George Gordon Meade is laid to rest at Laurel Hill Cemetery. His headstone itself is very simple, and particularly if you think about some of the other markers of our Civil War dead, Meade's stone is incredibly simple in comparison, and it's the writing on it is similarly so. He died, he did his work bravely, and is at rest. In Gettysburg, as this is going on, the funeral procession in Philadelphia, Gettysburg, the city most connected to George Gordon Meade outside of Philadelphia, collectively mourns as a town. Between 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock, all businesses in Gettysburg are closed, and there's black mourning materials on public and private buildings. There's a bell that will ding continuously through that hour, and I read newspaper accounts that say that artillery guns from the Soldiers National Cemetery will fire between 11 and 12. So outside of Philadelphia, Gettysburg, the city most associated with George Gordon Meade, similarly mourns the loss of Meade at the age of 56. And if you read through some of his correspondence that pours into his wife or his son, it is very clear that 1860s, 1870s Americans hold George Gordon Meade in incredibly high esteem. And I've extracted just a few lines from some of the letters that I've looked over. This, of course, is Theodore Lyman, who is one of Meade's aides and writes a great primary account about campaigning with him in the Overland Campaign. And Lyman says his service is brilliant and so devoted rendered. After Meade's death in 1872, Philadelphians are going to start a commemorative tradition. And the commemorative tradition with George Gordon Meade after his death really focuses at his grave. And what you would have seen in the 1870s and 1880s is Americans coming to Philadelphia, to Laurel Hill, to lay all sorts of wreaths and tributes at Meade's grave. This is an 1880s photograph. And what happens, that kind of emerges out of this graveside tribute after Meade's death, is that Philadelphians start thinking about a more tangible way to commemorate George Gordon Meade. And what they do, what emerges out of these celebrations or commemorations at his death, is to place a monument at Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. So this is a graveside tribute to George Gordon Meade, and they start thinking about creating a monument, and of course that's going to mean money, so we have to start thinking about ways to raise money for a monument to Meade. So on Memorial Day, 1880, the city of Philadelphia hosts basically a big fundraiser to raise money to put a monument to Meade in Fairmount Park. And they get some of the heaviest hitters in the Army of the Potomac and current politicians to come to Philadelphia in 1880 to give speeches and addresses to make money for this monument. And two of the individuals, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ages very well, doesn't he? Two individuals who will be there in 1880s, of course, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and then the guy on the right, that's right, President Hayes. Chamberlain, this event is held in the Music Auditorium in Philadelphia, and Chamberlain gives a great account of the Battle of Gettysburg, and he talks about the fighting on Little Round Top, and then knowing his audience, because speakers always need to know their audience, Chamberlain talks about after he was wounded, who carries him off the battlefield, what unit, what group of men, where are they from? Yeah, the Pennsylvanians, right? The 83rd Pennsylvanians. And he talks about how important the 83rd Pennsylvanians are to the fighting on Little Round Top, and the crowd goes wild. And of course, Chamberlain's a great orator. He's the ex-governor of Maine. And then Hayes gives an address, and then kind of the capstone to this event is William T. Sherman. And one of my favorite comments about Meade comes from Sherman. And that if you could erect a monument to George Gordon Meade of pure gold, it is not enough to honor George Gordon Meade. This event, Memorial Day 1880, starts fundraising for a monument to be erected at Fairmount Park. If you know a little bit about Meade in Philadelphia, Meade is intimately connected to Fairmount Park. He will be on the board at Fairmount Park, and observers would say that George Gordon Meade, either on horseback or on foot, would often be seen riding around, exploring Fairmount Park. So the good people of Philadelphia start the fundraiser to put a monument up to Meade, and they will put forth a variety of sketches until they settle on one that they like. This is one of the earlier sketches. There's an instrumental women's auxiliary group who will take over the fundraising for the monument. This is the Fairmount Park Art Association. And then finally, on October the 18th, 1887, George Gordon Meade gets his first equestrian monument in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. Congress had authorized this monument, and it is made in part of condemned cannon. The keynote speaker of the day for the dedication event at Fairmount Park is one of Meade's most trusted, intimate confidants, who is John Gibbon. Gibbon gives the keynote, and the Grand Master of Ceremonies is another prominent Philadelphian, one of Meade's very close confidants, James Biddle, and he's the keynote Master of Ceremonies. So this is October 18, 1887, and there's a whole big celebration that day. I'll give you a quote of the Fairmount Park Art Association, very much speaking to Meade's legacy. Again, so for all that shifting controversy that we see in Meade's own lifetime, in death, Americans, Pennsylvanians particularly leading the way on this, really revere George Gordon Meade. And they truly believe that this man, amongst a few other Union generals, was responsible for preservation of the Union. So if you have the opportunity and you're in Philadelphia, check out Fairmount Park. Check out Meade's statue. Fairmount Park is worth its own kind of few hours on a nice afternoon. This is an aerial view of Fairmount Park. Remember, Philadelphia holds the Centennial Expedition. So this monstrosity here is the Centennial Expedition building. This is it's called the Smith Arch, and on the Smith Arch you will find George Gordon Meade. He's at one of the top of the obelisks. And there's other Pennsylvanian generals there. Reynolds is there. Hancock is there. But where next Meade in this photo? Meade is, you see him? There we go. To the right. He's over there. This monument now is wildly controversial because if y'all go to Philadelphia, go to City Center, to the City Hall, and you can find Civil War generals outside of City Hall, one of which will be McClellan, one of which will be Reynolds, and there are people in Philadelphia today and in the more recent past who want to get Meade moved from Fairmount Park and put him in City Center, a place that today is more prominent than Fairmount Park. But there is some resistance to that from different factions of people. Where monuments are placed is very important, and particularly in today's landscape. So Philadelphia is the first city to put up an equestrian monument to George Gordon Meade. The next place that Meade's going to see an equestrian monument is here in Gettysburg. And if you know a little bit about the history of Gettysburg, you know a little bit about the GBMA, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, and this grassroots preservation entity, you know a little bit about some of the early monuments that go up here on the Gettysburg battlefield. The Union High Command gets memorialized at Gettysburg pretty quickly. But the Union High Command that gets memorialized at Gettysburg is not George Gordon Meade, who was the first Union general to have a memorial on this battlefield. That's right. It is John Fulton Reynolds, prominent Pennsylvanian in his own right, of course, killed here on July the 1st, the morning. This monument to Reynolds' mortally wounded shot goes up on July 1st, 1886. This is what stop one on the auto tour. This one goes up in 1886. And if you think about Reynolds, he's also in the National Cemetery. This monument is erected on August 31st, 1872. And then there's one more, right out on, off on Chambersburg Road. So Reynolds is memorialized threefold here at the Battle of Gettysburg. And finally, Meade gets a monument. Different GAR posts are going to be petitioning for Meade to get a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield, and they also want Winfield Scott Hancock to get a memorial here at Gettysburg. And through the GAR efforts, the state of Pennsylvania is going to kind of contract out a sculptor to do a monument here on the Gettysburg battlefield. And that sculptor, you might be familiar with his name, this is Alexander Calder, Scott. He will sculpt the memorial here for Meade, and it is erected on June 5th, 1896. This is a cool photograph. It's cool in a couple ways. It's a historic photograph of the Meade Memorial, but take a good look at it and you can see how a lot of landscape features change and a lot of commemoration features change. So what's missing here? If you go look at the Meade Memorial today, what do you see on the side of it? Yeah, big plaques that will outline George Gordon Meade's accomplishments. Here they're missing. They're put up later. They're not part of the original monument. You also won't see this, hey, you damn kids, keep off the grass sign. Although, personally, I think we'd all be in favor of something like that again. And this is also kind of cool. Historic photographs are as valuable as primary documents. They are primary documents. They're as valuable as written documents. Look at the fencing patterns in the back, which are now, of course, eliminated. Those are old War Department features. And there's a cool little gazebo over on the far right of the monument. So George Gordon Meade gets his monument here just up from the Leicester House on June the 5th. The dedication ceremonies are at 10:30 in the morning. But poor Meade, he doesn't even get a day at all to himself. Because at 2 o'clock they go and they dedicate the Winfield Scott Hancock Memorial. So Meade gets half of a day. He gets a shared day with Hancock. A lot of Meade's descendants are going to come to Gettysburg for the occasion. This is a cool family photo taken that day outside the Leicester House, which has a variety of Meade's descendants. The monument itself is unveiled by Meade's grandson. And finally, the victor of Gettysburg is commemorated on the landscape itself. And for quite some time, the Meade Memorial is a popular place to visit. And in 1913, a lot of the veterans for the iconic 50th anniversary reunion will spend time looking at the Meade Memorial. So now you see, now it looks familiar, right? There's the bronze plaques. And this is cool. Yeah, that's the Ziegler's Grove Tower, which goes down in the early 1960s when the Park Service builds the cyclorama. There's see, they still have that sign. So check out the Meade Memorial. Of course, you all do, and now he's facing the Lee Memorial, which goes up in the early part of the 20th century on Seminary Ridge. One of the things that struck me in my research so far for this final chapter of the book is the way in which Meade's reputation is linked to other individuals. So Meade gets a monument, Philadelphia. The second one that goes up here at Gettysburg. And then the third Meade Memorial is the one I've researched a lot of most recently, and that's the one in Washington, D.C. And the Meade Memorial in Washington, D.C. has an incredibly interesting history. And we talk a lot today in 2018, and it was really big news last year in 2017 about the place of Civil War tributes on our national landscape, but specifically the place in which Confederate soldiers hold in monumentation and commemoration in the 21st century. And this is stuff that played out in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is stuff that plays out other places in New Orleans where they take Robert E. Lee off of that top pedestal. And we're reconsidering the place of Confederate tributes. Well, one of the places that Robert E. Lee is commemorated is in Washington, D.C. And it's in Statuary Hall. Have any of you been to Statuary Hall to see this? There's the diehards, like the people who go and do Civil War things on spring break. Robert E. Lee gets a monument in Statuary Hall in 1909. Statuary Hall is in the Capitol building. So this is its own kind of separate topic about whether or not Lee belongs in the U.S. Capitol. That's not my point. The point of what is going to be important for Meade is that when Lee goes up in Statuary Hall in 1909, there are already Civil War monuments dotting the D.C. landscape. And by the time George Gordon Meade gets a monument in Washington, D.C., there are 17 tributes to other Civil War generals. And when the Lee Monument goes up in Statuary Hall in 1909, the Pennsylvanians are a little upset. And particularly the Veterans Association, the Philadelphia Brigade Association. You guys have all heard about that. That's the 72nd Pennsylvania kind of stuff over here. They're really outraged that Robert E. Lee gets a monument in D.C., but their own general does not. So the next year, 1910, the Philadelphia Brigade Association approaches Harrisburg to the state government, and they say, let's raise money to put a memorial up to George Gordon Meade in Washington, D.C. So it's interesting that the impetus to the Meade Memorial in Washington, D.C. is Robert E. Lee, his adversary for so long. And it works. The government in Harrisburg is receptive to this. They're excited for the idea. And of course, as any government then does, they create a commission, right? So they organize a commission called the Pennsylvania George Gordon Meade Memorial Association. And the head of the state commission, or one of the prominent voices of the state commission, to design a monument to George Gordon Meade is John W. Frasier. Frasier is a veteran. He's a Pennsylvanian. He's a veteran of the 71st Pennsylvania. And let me tell you, if I would ever have a monument erected to myself, I would want this guy to be my voice. Well, that would be weird because it would be from the dead, but so sort of what I'm saying is this is the guy that you want to champion a monument for you. His objective is complete devotion to George Gordon Meade. This is 1915. The whole process of erecting a monument to George Gordon Meade, he is intimately involved with, and he wants to create a monument that tangibly gives us the impression that George Gordon Meade was a victor at Gettysburg, a great leader, very militaristic. He has this vision of what he wants. Well, the problem is that John W. Frasier, like me, we don't know anything about art. So he has what he wants, but he's a veteran, and he doesn't have a really good understanding of the nuances of art. So because this monument goes up in D.C., there's a federal commission involved. So you get the Harrisburg contingent with a lot of veterans who are going to say, this is what I want Meade to be. But then you get Washington, D.C., mingling their voice in, and they bring in a group of artists. And that will be the Commission on Fine Arts. And they hate John W. Frasier. They say he is a totally unfit person to work with, and he is obstructive and insulting. Now, the Commission on Fine Arts has the nation's most distinguished artists on it. And they're responsible for all the artwork in the nation's capital. So you get the CFA, the Commission on Fine Arts, and then you get the Frasier sorts, and somewhere they got to compromise to come up with a memorial that's both sides will agree on, that's fitting and proper for George Gordon Meade. And one of the things that guides this conversation is Meade cannot be more elaborate or exorbitant than Ulysses S. Grant. So the Grant Memorial goes up in 1922. So it's the centennial of Grant's birth. And if you think about the location, and the location of monuments matter, Grant is located, right outside the Capitol building, in one of the most prominent vistas today and at the time. Frasier hates this monument. And he says, and if you look at it, the Grant Monument, what the heck are the lions about? Right? That's what Frasier says. Frasier says, what are the lions about? So Frasier and the CFA go back and forth, and they need to find a location, so they're going to put Meade on Pennsylvania Avenue and the intersection of 3rd Northwest Street. So he's within kind of the scope of the Grant, the Capitol building. I'll show you some aerial photos, but not too close that it overshadows Grant. Pennsylvania definitely wants to have their voice on this monument. Frasier, of course, leading the charge, so they want a Pennsylvanian to design the monument. And that takes them to pick Charles Grafley. Grafley is a Philadelphian, a very prominent artist in his own right. And he's really, man, this guy's put through the ringer trying to appease the veterans, the Frasier shorts that says, I want a very militaristic George Gordon Meade, and then the CFA that's a little more mild-mannered and tempered. So Grafley does like 16 sketches, 16 options of a Meade Memorial. And I'm going to show you two. All right, so one option is all right, any artists in the crowd? What the heck is this? This is one of Grafley's picks. Now, this is called E Pluribus Unum. That's a bastardized Latin expression that I just said. It means it's on our currency. Okay, so that's this. This is out of many, one. I'm not one that can really look at art and get all these deep meanings out of it. But what this is supposed to be is George Gordon Meade struggling to hold the Union together. Oh, yeah, now you're like, wow, I see it. I got it now, I got it. Yes. This is where you kind of like stand back and you kind of, reflect and you sigh and you're like, oh, yeah, yeah. So there's the North and the South and secession, and Meade is holding the Union together. This is actually Grafley's favorite. He likes it so well that he has a little one cast. What do you think Frasier says about this? Right, WTF, Grafley. So that one gets nixed. There's no way that Frasier's going to let that go. I'll show you a second option, and this one, This is not bad, right? This is Meade. This is supposed to be Meade on the pursuit from Gettysburg. They call it like the silent Meade, where he's reflecting over the strategic plans and operations at the Potomac River. This one has some potential. I kind of like that one as well, but Grafley likes this one, but the Pennsylvania folks don't. They don't feel like this is really militaristic enough. So we need something even more. And what they end up settling on after a bunch of back and forth on these sketches is the one that sits in DC, which is Meade and Allegory. So here, this is a cool photo. This is Grafley, and this is a model of what will become the monument that sits in DC. And if y'all go to the, you're down in DC, go to the National Art Gallery, you can see the model in one of the rooms in DC. It's kind of cool, a scale model of it. So they like that one. Frasier's not wowed about Allegory. That's why he doesn't like the lions on Grant. And he's not really wowed about Allegory writ large. And if you can kind of follow the faces around here, they are allegorical representations of various facets of war and peace. But Meade stands not on an equestrian, but at the center with his kind of his cape, kind of coming out like Superman pose, stepping onto the future, stepping forward to the future to represent a nation that is reconciled, that is reunited. So this one works. This is the one that they all can settle on, that is good, that they'll agree does justice to George Gordon Meade. So they have the money, they're fundraising along the way. A lot of the money comes from Pennsylvania. This monument costs $400,000, and it's all raised by the state of Pennsylvania. And on the 28th March, 1922, ground is broken for the monument. This guy here on our left is the governor of Pennsylvania. This is William Sproul. And on the right is, at that time, the President of the United States. Oh, you guys know your president's very good. Yes, that's Warren G. Harding. And this sits at Pennsylvania Avenue and 3rd Northwest. And I'll show you an aerial view in a second. So Pennsylvania is kicking up $400,000 for this. It comes in fits and starts, as any government appropriation does. And they'll break the ground and then very slowly construct a monument. This is kind of a cool photo. You can see the Capitol building in the background. And here are the allegories. And then we'll place Meade at the top. The Bartholdi fountain we can see here as well. So this goes up. This is a photo that's taken in 1925. And if you could drop yourself and have a cool aerial view where Meade in DC is placed, this is a really cool photo. So this would be us standing kind of at the Capitol building. So here's Grant and his lions. To my right, middle, there's Meade. Obviously, DC's changed a lot in the last 80 years. And one thing very noticeably absent is the little reflecting pool, which is now in front of the Grant Memorial. And this photo shows very much kind of the open vistas. So Grant, look at him keeping an eye on George. There. It's like that photo I showed you at the beginning, over Meade's shoulder. He's keeping an eye on him. And the location works. So the monument's going to be dedicated in 1927. And here's Grant keeping an eye on his subordinate, George. And I said about how Meade's legacy is always interwoven with people who are going to be more prominent than him. Lee at Statuary Hall, the Grant Monument here, everything is, you cannot overshadow Grant, you cannot overshadow Grant. So to add almost insult to injury for George Gordon Meade, the master of ceremonies, the guy that's in charge of the dedication in 1927 is U.S. Grant III. U.S. Grant III is in charge of, he basically runs it's like the public office building and landscapes in D.C., and he's in charge of kind of organizing and managing public spaces in Washington at the time. So U.S. Grant III will be doing all the logistics for the dedication, which happens in October 19. So this monument takes a long time to come to fruition. It's 16 years from the time that the original idea is proposed until we get for it to be unveiled. This is a cool photo. This is the unveiling of the monument we're kind of in the speaker's seating here. Here's the President of the United States, who now in 1929 is, oh, you know your president. You're much better than my U.S. history kids. Calvin Coolidge. George Gordon Meade will have 29 descendants there. And the one who gets to unveil the monument is his only surviving child by now. This is Henrietta. And here's U.S. Grant III. So she looks like she's having a good time, it seems. The Meade Memorial is draped in 2 huge white flags, and she gets to kind of pull the flag, and then very slowly the monument comes into view. She lives, just as a factoid, she lives until Henrietta, until 1944. And she's here with Meade. If you go through the dedication ceremonies and look really at the DC monument, the dedication ceremonies give us the same kind of insight and rhetoric that we saw with Meade all along, where speakers and orators will commemorate and laud Meade's accomplishments. They're very much respectful and very confident that his place in history will be secured. One of the keynote addresses, of course, comes from the President of the United States. And here, right, so for all the bluster and gusto that Meade gets during his lifetime about not attacking, say, at the Potomac River in mid-July, now time has given a little bit more objectivity to this, and the president actually admires Meade's decision. There are scores of veterans here. They would come in. They got like free admission, so to say. The veterans have their own speakers, speaker stands to watch this unveiling. And I'll show you kind of a cool aerial photo because the history beyond the dedication of the Meade Memorial is kind of neat. So the one on the top is our kind of our same vantage that we had earlier. This is 1936. So here's Grant, and then in the box is Meade, 1936. The bottom one's 1992. And look at how much that part of DC's changed. So now we see Grant with his lions, and now that big old reflecting pool was put in. And what you don't see now, because he'd be underwater almost, is Meade. So when DC becomes the urban sprawl with all the developments, all the roads, all the more buildings that permeate the landscape now, George Meade's monument is an obstruction to this kind of development. So in the 1960s, the U.S. government takes the Meade Monument down, and they put in this reflecting pool, and they put, I think it's I-395, that's going to kind of meander around this part of D.C., and they put George Meade in storage. Oh, and he sits in storage for about 15 years. And this is one of the like research is fun and it takes you in weird places. And one of the things I got to research on in DC, this is a Park Service controlled monument now, is I went to some of the Park Service sites and researched about the George Meade Monument. And the historian down there in DC says, you know, I don't really know that much about the George Meade Monument in DC. And it sat in storage for about 15 years. And I was reading through all this correspondence. So this is the late 60s into the 70s and into the early 80s. And they wrapped him up, and they put him, literally, he sat outside, wrapped up, and he was vandalized. And his nose was broken off, and his fingers were broken, and then someone stole the gilded wreath that sits up at the top. And I read this, some correspondence that people didn't even know where he was for a while. He seemed kind of lost to history. But which isn't to say anything bad, of course, about the National Park Service in the 70s and 80s. Is that right, John Heiser? So Meade's rededicated. So he's found, and he's brought out of storage, and he's rededicated October the 3rd, 1984. And now he sits in a new place. This is the gilded wreath that was stolen. So this is recommissioned and cast again. Now he sits a little bit further away from his original place. This is a cool aerial. So this is DC today. Here's, of course, our Capitol building. Here's Grant. Here's the big reflecting pool. And Meade now sits right here. And the National Park Service is planning to clean him up this summer. Because if you go there now, you'll probably find a bunch of kids skateboarding around him, and he's looking a little worn, but they have him slated in their maintenance upgrade this summer. So, what can we take away from kind of all of that? I'll leave you with a quote from one of Meade's most beloved and faithful subordinates, James Biddle. So my big takeaway about Meade in memory is that Gettysburg shapes Meade's reputation. And for all the controversy and criticism that comes out of what Meade should have, could have done, after Meade's death, those voices are quieted. And in the 1870s and beyond through the 1920s, Meade sees a resurgence in popularity, and he sees a grateful nation finally putting him in the place proper for preservation of the Union. His place in America's historical consciousness now seems a little murky, at least if you all run out to the store and buy that $75 piece of art. It seems a little murky, but for, 4 decades after the war, George Gordon Meade's place in American national memory in our Civil War consciousness is very, very much esteemed. So indeed, I think Biddle is correct. History, for that time period at least, has done him justice. So I appreciate y'all's attendance. This is terrific. This is fun. I hope you got a little insight to Meade in memory. And I think we have some time. I don't think they're kicking us right out at 2:30. So I'll be happy to take any questions that you want, unless you want me to give some deep meaning to that art sketch of Grafley's, because I'm probably not able to do that. But anything else, I'll be happy to do. So thank you all very much. I appreciate your attendance.